On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and introduced the iPhone. Within 24 hours, Nokia, the company that made nearly half of all mobile phones sold on Earth, had assembled a 9-person team to analyze the threat. Their conclusion, written in an internal presentation the following day, was unambiguous. The Apple iPhone is a serious challenger in the high-end segment. The touchscreen interface, they wrote, could become a new standard and represented the biggest threat Nokia faced. They saw it clearly. They named it precisely. They outlined what needed to be done. 6 years later, Nokia's mobile phone division was sold to Microsoft for $5.4 billion, a fraction of what it had been worth. The company that had shipped 463 million phones in 2007 was, for practical purposes, no longer in the phone business. Nokia didn't fail because it missed the iPhone. It failed because seeing what is coming and doing something about it turned out to be two entirely different things. The reality was more complicated, and in some ways, more instructive than the story most people tell about it. To understand what Nokia lost, you have to understand what Nokia was. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Nokia was one of the most successful companies on Earth. It had not always been a phone company. It had started in 1865 as a paper mill in Finland, and had over the following century diversified into rubber boots, cables, and consumer electronics before finding its footing in mobile telecommunications in the late 1980s. The timing was perfect. Mobile phones were transitioning from expensive business tools to mass-market consumer products. Nokia understood this shift earlier and better than almost anyone. It designed phones that were reliable, affordable, and crucially, desirable. The Nokia 3310, launched in 2000, became one of the best-selling consumer electronics products in history. By the mid-2000s, Nokia held roughly 40% of the global mobile phone market, making it by far the world's largest mobile phone manufacturer. The financial results were extraordinary. By 1999, the company's annual profit had reached $4 billion. Nokia was Finland's most valuable company, its largest taxpayer, and in many ways its most important cultural export. The town of Salo, where Nokia manufactured phones, was a Nokia town in the way that Rochester had been a Kodak town. The company's success was not merely commercial, it was national. And at the heart of Nokia's success was a particular theory of what a phone was. A phone was a communication device. It should be reliable, affordable, durable, with long battery life and a keyboard that worked. Nokia was extraordinarily good at making phones by this definition. It had manufacturing scale, global distribution, carrier relationships, and a brand that was trusted by hundreds of millions of people. The iPhone redefined what a phone was, and Nokia's theory, which had made it great, became the thing that made it slow. The internal Nokia presentation, created on January 10, 2007, now publicly available in the Nokia Design Archive at Aalto University, is a remarkable document. It is not a document written by people who missed the point. It is a document written by people who understood the point completely and were alarmed by it. The 9-person team identified the iPhone's touchscreen interface as potentially transformative. They noted that Nokia's own user interface strength was eroding. They wrote that urgent action was needed. They outlined specific responses, including the appointment of a chief user interface architect to coordinate Nokia's design approach across its fragmented product lines. They also identified what they believed were the iPhone's weaknesses: no physical keyboard, high price, no third-generation network support, limited battery life, no ability to change the battery, restricted application support. These were real limitations. At launch in 2007, the first iPhone could not even send multimedia messages. It ran on a slower network than Nokia's high-end devices. By the technical specifications that Nokia used to evaluate phones, the iPhone was an inferior product in several important respects. This is where Nokia made its critical error, not in failing to see the iPhone, but in evaluating it by the wrong criteria. Nokia measured phones by hardware specifications and network capabilities. The iPhone's power was not in its hardware specifications. It was in its user experience, the feeling of using it, the simplicity of its interface, the integration of music, internet, and communication into a single seamless device. These were things that did not appear in a technical specification sheet. Nokia understood them intellectually, but could not translate that understanding into action quickly enough. The story of Nokia's failure is not a story about a company that didn't understand the iPhone. It is a story about a company that couldn't reorganize itself fast enough to respond to what it understood. By 2007, Nokia was a vast, complex organization. It had multiple competing product lines: the N-series high-end smartphones, the mass-market feature phones, experimental platforms, including the Linux-based Maemo system. These product lines were run by different divisions with different priorities, different budgets, and different theories about what Nokia's future should look like. The internal competition between Symbian, Nokia's existing smartphone operating system, and Maemo, its more advanced but less developed alternative, was fierce and unresolved. Engineers and managers who had built their careers on Symbian resisted the shift to a new platform. The organizational incentives pushed people to protect what existed, rather than build what was needed. There was also a cultural problem. Nokia's leadership in the mid-2000s became increasingly hierarchical and risk-averse. A widely reported phenomenon among Nokia engineers at the time was what researchers later called internal fear. Middle managers were afraid to deliver bad news upward. Problems were concealed rather than escalated. The gap between what the engineers knew and what the leadership acted on grew wider, even as the competitive threat intensified. Stephen Elop, who became Nokia's CEO in 2010, described the company in a now famous internal memo as a burning platform, a reference to an offshore oil worker who, faced with a burning platform, had to jump into the cold water or be consumed by the flames. Nokia, Elop wrote, was standing on a burning platform and had not yet jumped. The memo was intended as a call to action. It was also, in retrospect, an accurate description of what had been happening for 3 years. The speed of Nokia's decline, once it began, was stunning. In 2007, Nokia remained the world's largest mobile phone manufacturer, with roughly 40% of the global handset market, and was valued at well over $200 billion. Apple's share of the smartphone market was still relatively small. By 2012, Nokia's global smartphone market share had collapsed to under 5%. Its stock price had fallen by more than 90% from its peak. The Symbian operating system, which Nokia had bet on as its smartphone platform, was widely regarded as outdated and difficult to use. The company had attempted to build a competing touchscreen phone, the Nokia N97, launched in 2009. It was widely criticized for poor software performance and an unintuitive interface. In 2011, Nokia announced a partnership with Microsoft to adopt Windows Phone as its smartphone operating system, abandoning Symbian after years of investment and effectively admitting that its software platform had failed. The partnership with Microsoft produced credible hardware but could not recapture market share from Apple's iOS and Google's Android, which between them had come to define the smartphone market. In September 2013, Microsoft acquired Nokia's mobile phone division for $5.4 billion. The company that had been worth well over $200 billion 6 years earlier had sold its core business for a fraction of that sum. Microsoft itself eventually wrote down most of the acquisition's value, laying off tens of thousands of former Nokia employees. The Salo factory, once the heart of Nokia's manufacturing operation, was closed. Nokia today exists as a much smaller company focused on telecommunications infrastructure and patent licensing. It does not make consumer phones. The brand name is licensed to other manufacturers. The empire is gone. The Nokia story is often told as a cautionary tale about corporate arrogance, a company so convinced of its own superiority that it failed to take a competitor seriously. The internal documents now available suggest this is not quite right. Nokia took the iPhone seriously from day one. Its engineers understood the threat. Its internal documents show people who are alarmed, not dismissive. The real lesson of Nokia is more uncomfortable. Knowing what the threat is and being able to respond to it are different capabilities, and large, successful organizations are systematically better at the first than the second. The organizational structures that make a company efficient at doing what it currently does, the hierarchies, the processes, the incentives, the cultures, are often precisely the things that make it slow to do something new. Nokia had the engineers, it had the resources, it had the brand, it had the carrier relationships. It had in its Maemo platform a more advanced operating system than anything it shipped commercially. What it did not have was the organizational agility to turn those assets into the right product at the right time. The iPhone did not defeat Nokia with superior technology. It defeated Nokia with superior execution and with an organizational culture that could move faster than Nokia's could. That is a harder lesson than don't ignore your competitors. It suggests that the companies most at risk from disruption are not the complacent ones. They are the ones that see it coming, understand it clearly, and still cannot move fast enough. The Nokia Design Archive, opened to the public in January 2025, contains thousands of documents from Nokia's history, design sketches, product prototypes, internal presentations, and strategy documents spanning decades of mobile phone development. Among them is the 9-page presentation created on January 10, 2007, the day after the iPhone was announced. 9 people who understood exactly what they were looking at, who named the threat precisely, who outlined what needed to be done. Nokia's mobile phone division was sold 6 years later. The presentation is still there in the archive. Clear, accurate, alarming, and, in retrospect, heartbreaking. They saw it coming. Seeing it was not enough.